Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The moment I saw my name missing from my baby's birth certificate, my stomach dropped. In its place was a name that didn't belong. My mother-in-law's. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. My hands started to shake as I held the paper, my mind racing to piece together how this could have happened. I thought it was a mistake, maybe some kind of administrative error. But deep down, I knew better. This was Linda's doing. Let me back up. My mother-in-law, Linda, had always been a little intense. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and instantly take over, whether you wanted her to or not. When I married Jake, I knew Linda came with a package. She was overbearing, sure, but I figured I could handle it. At first, it was little things. Linda would show up unannounced, rearrange my kitchen, or insist that I was doing things wrong when it came to taking care of Jake. Jake likes his shirts folded this way, not that way, she'd say with a patronizing smile, as if I were her assistant. When I got pregnant, though, things escalated. Linda inserted herself into every decision. What stroller to buy, what color to paint the nursery, even what names we should consider. I chalked it up to excitement, telling myself she just wanted to help. But looking back, I can see the signs were there all along. The first major red flag came at the hospital. I'd just given birth, exhausted and emotional, when Linda swept in like she owned the place. She held my baby longer than I did that first day, barking orders at the nurses and snapping at Jake whenever he tried to intervene. She's just excited, Jake said later, trying to smooth things over. Excited is one thing, I shot back. She acted like it was her baby, not ours. I didn't know it then, but that moment was just the beginning. 2 weeks after we brought our son, Noah, home, Linda showed up with a stack of papers. She said they were just some routine things to sign for the baby's health insurance and future planning. Still foggy from sleep deprivation, I didn't think much of it. But something about the way she hovered made me hesitate. I skimmed the papers and found nothing alarming until I got to the last page. "What's this?" I asked, holding up a document that listed her as Noah's primary guardian in case of emergency. Linda waved it off like it was nothing. "Oh, don't worry about that. It's just a formality. You know, in case something happens to you or Jake." I stared at her, my gut screaming that this wasn't right. "We don't need this," I said firmly. Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Suit yourself," she said, snatching the papers back. "I'm just trying to help, Sarah. You'll thank me later." That phrase, "you'll thank me later," stuck with me. At the time, I thought it was just another one of Linda's passive-aggressive comments. But now, standing in my kitchen with Noah's birth certificate in hand, those words took on a whole new meaning. She hadn't just overstepped. She'd crossed a line I didn't even know existed. I stared at the certificate, my heart pounding. How had she done this? How had she managed to remove my name and replace it with hers? And more importantly, what else had she done that I didn't know about? I knew one thing for sure. I had to find out. From the outside, Linda seemed like the perfect grandmother. She bought Noah expensive clothes, brought over gourmet dinners so I wouldn't have to cook, and posted every milestone on her Facebook page with captions like, "So blessed to be Noah's grandma." But the longer I lived with her constant involvement, the more I realized those kind gestures came with strings attached. It started small. She'd criticize how I held Noah or how I fed him. "You really should try harder with breastfeeding," she'd say, even though my doctor had assured me that formula was fine. She'd pick apart every parenting choice I made, acting like she had a lifetime of experience raising my child. Jake, of course, didn't see the problem. "She's just excited," he'd say, brushing it off. "This is her first grandkid. Let her be involved." I wanted to scream. Being involved was one thing, but what Linda was doing went beyond that. She wasn't trying to help. She was trying to take over. The turning point came when she started calling Noah my baby in casual conversation. "My baby looks so cute in this outfit," she'd coo, holding him close. Or, "Don't worry, I know what's best for my baby." At first, I thought it was just a slip of the tongue, an innocent mistake. But the more she said it, the more deliberate it seemed. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. "Linda," I said, forcing a smile, "you know he's my baby, right?" She looked up from where she was bouncing Noah on her knee, her expression cool and unbothered. "Of course, Sarah. Don't be so sensitive. It's just a figure of speech." But the smirk on her face said otherwise. A few weeks later, she started showing up unannounced. It didn't matter if I was in the middle of a diaper change or trying to catch a rare nap while Noah slept. Linda would barge in with bags of baby supplies, insisting that I needed her help. One afternoon, I was feeding Noah in the living room when she arrived with a shiny new stroller. What's wrong with the one we already have? I asked, trying to keep my frustration in check. Oh, it's fine, she said dismissively. But this one is better. Safer. You're welcome. I didn't even get a chance to argue before she started unpacking it. That's when it hit me. Linda wasn't just trying to help. She was positioning herself as the ultimate authority on Noah's care, subtly undermining me at every turn. The real red flags began when she started bringing up legal matters. You know, Sarah, she said one evening over dinner, it's smart to plan for the worst. What if something happens to you or Jake? Have you thought about who would take care of Noah? We have, I said quickly, hoping to shut the conversation down. Jake and I have talked about it, but Linda wasn't deterred. Well, I think it's obvious that I'd be the best choice, she said with a smile, as if she were offering me a favor. I stared at her, stunned. We haven't made any decisions like that, I said firmly. She waved her hand dismissively. Oh, don't be silly. Who else would you trust? I raised Jake, didn't I? I know what I'm doing. I wanted to say yes, and Jake still can't figure out how to load the dishwasher, but I bit my tongue. Arguing with Linda was like trying to fight quicksand. The more you pushed, the deeper you sank. It was around this time that I noticed Jake becoming quieter during these conversations. He wasn't exactly taking Linda's side, but he wasn't standing up to her either. Jake, I said one night after she'd left, you have to talk to her. She's overstepping. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I know she could be a lot, but she means well. She's just trying to help, Sarah. There was again. That phrase, just trying to help. How is replacing me as Noah's mother helping? I snapped. Jake's eyes widened. What are you talking about? I hesitated, unsure if I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Linda's behavior wasn't just overbearing. It was deliberate. She was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push before I pushed back. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon, and I was sorting through a pile of mail when I came across an envelope addressed to Linda. The return address was from a legal office I didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. Inside was a letter regarding custody paperwork, drafted with Linda's name listed as the primary guardian for Noah. My name was nowhere on it. My heart pounded as I scanned the document, my hands shaking with anger. This wasn't just crossing a line. This was obliterating it. I knew then that Linda's behavior wasn't just meddling. It was calculated. She was actively trying to push me out of my own child's life. What would you do in my position? Would you confront her immediately or wait until you had more proof? I chose the latter. I needed to be smart about this, to make sure she couldn't wiggle her way out of it. But as I started piecing together the full extent of her scheme, I realized just how far Linda was willing to go to take control. The letter from the legal office sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. I couldn't stop staring at it, my mind racing with questions. How had Linda gotten this far without me noticing? What else had she done behind my back? And most importantly, how the hell was I going to stop her? I waited until Jake came home from work before bringing it up. I wanted him to see the document for himself, to understand the depth of what his mother was trying to do. Jake, I said carefully, holding up the letter, do you know anything about this? He frowned, taking it from my hands. As his eyes scanned the page, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. What the hell is this? He muttered, looking up at me. That's what I'd like to know, I said, my voice tight. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This has to be some kind of mistake. She wouldn't. He trailed off, but we both knew the end of that sentence. She wouldn't what, Jake? Cross a boundary? Manipulate us? Lie. Jake sighed, clearly torn. I'll talk to her, he said finally. No, I said firmly. Not yet. If we confront her now, she'll deny everything. I need to figure out exactly what she's been doing first. He hesitated but eventually nodded. Okay, but Sarah, we can't let this get out of hand. Too late for that, I muttered under my breath. The next day I started digging. I pulled out every piece of paperwork Linda had ever handed me since Noah was born, scanning each one for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find something that made my blood run cold. There it was, buried in a stack of documents Linda had insisted we sign for the baby's future. A form granting her temporary guardianship of Noah in the event of an emergency. And the kicker? My signature was missing. Instead, someone had forged my name. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. The signature wasn't even close to mine. It was a sloppy imitation, but it had been enough to slip past me in the chaos of those early postpartum days. I felt sick. This wasn't just overstepping, this was fraud. Linda had gone out of her way to make it look like I'd agreed to something I hadn't. I called Jake immediately. She forged my signature, I said, my voice shaking. Are you sure? He asked, though the doubt in his voice made me want to scream. Yes, Jake. I'm sure. I didn't sign this. Look at it yourself if you don't believe me. He sighed. Okay. I believe you. What do you want to do? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I want to know how far this goes. I'm not confronting her until I have every piece of evidence I need to expose her. Over the next few days, I combed through every interaction I'd had with Linda since Noah was born, trying to piece together her scheme. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't some impulsive act of overenthusiasm. This was premeditated. She'd been laying the groundwork for months, using her position as a helpful grandmother to slip under the radar. The forged documents, the unsolicited advice, the constant presence, it was all part of her plan to position herself as Noah's true parent. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to feel guilty about it. The next time Linda came over, I couldn't even look at her without wanting to scream. She acted like everything was normal, waltzing into the house with a bag of baby clothes and a tray of homemade cookies. How's my little angel? She cooed, scooping Noah up into her arms. I forced a smile, though my jaw ached from clenching it so hard. He's fine, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She looked at me, her smile widening. You know, Sarah, you're lucky to have me. Most new moms don't have someone like me to help them out. I wanted to tell her exactly where she could shove her help, but I bit my tongue. I needed to keep my cool, at least for now. Later that night, I sat down with Jake and laid out everything I'd found, the forged documents, the custody paperwork, and the patterns of manipulation. This isn't just overbearing behavior, I said, pointing to the evidence spread out on the table. She's trying to replace me, Jake. She wants to cut me out of my own child's life. Jake was silent for a long time, his face pale. I can't believe she would do this, he said finally. Well, she did, I snapped, and now we have to decide what to do about it. He looked at me, his expression torn. She's still my mom, Sarah. I can't just cut her off. I stared at him, my chest tightening. Jake, if you don't stand up to her, she'll never stop. Is that what you want? For her to keep controlling our lives? He didn't answer, and the silence between us was louder than any argument. I knew then that this wasn't just about Linda anymore. This was about Jake, too, and whether he was willing to put his family first. But one thing was clear. I wasn't waiting for him to make a decision. Linda had crossed the line, and I was going to make damn sure she couldn't do it again. The letter from the legal office sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. I couldn't stop staring at it, my mind racing with questions. How had Linda gotten this far without me noticing? What else had she done behind my back? And most importantly, how the hell was I going to stop her? I waited until Jake came home from work before bringing it up. I wanted him to see the document for himself, to understand the depth of what his mother was trying to do. Jake, I said carefully, holding up the letter, do you know anything about this? He frowned, taking it from my hands. As his eyes scanned the page, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. What the hell is this? He muttered, looking up at me. That's what I'd like to know, I said, my voice tight. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. This has to be some kind of mistake. She wouldn't. He trailed off, but we both knew the end of that sentence. She wouldn't what, Jake? Cross a boundary? Manipulate us? Lie. Jake sighed, clearly torn. I'll talk to her, he said finally. No, I said firmly. Not yet. If we confront her now, she'll deny everything. I need to figure out exactly what she's been doing first. He hesitated, but eventually nodded. Okay, but Sarah, we can't let this get out of hand. Too late for that, I muttered under my breath. The next day I started digging. I pulled out every piece of paperwork Linda had ever handed me since Noah was born, scanning each one for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find something that made my blood run cold. There it was, buried in a stack of documents Linda had insisted we sign for the baby's future. A form granting her temporary guardianship of Noah in the event of an emergency. And the kicker? My signature was missing. Instead, someone had forged my name. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. The signature wasn't even close to mine. It was a sloppy imitation, but it had been enough to slip past me in the chaos of those early postpartum days. I felt sick. This wasn't just overstepping. This was fraud. Linda had gone out of her way to make it look like I'd agreed to something I hadn't. I called Jake immediately. She forged my signature, I said, my voice shaking. Are you sure? He asked, though the doubt in his voice made me want to scream. Yes, Jake. I'm sure. I didn't sign this. Look at it yourself if you don't believe me. He sighed. Okay. I believe you. What do you want to do? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I want to know how far this goes. I'm not confronting her until I have every piece of evidence I need to expose her. Over the next few days, I combed through every interaction I'd had with Linda since Noah was born, trying to piece together her scheme. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't some impulsive act of overenthusiasm. This was premeditated. She'd been laying the groundwork for months, using her position as a helpful grandmother to slip under the radar. The forged documents, the unsolicited advice, the constant presence. It was all part of her plan to position herself as Noah's true parent. And the worst part? She didn't even seem to feel guilty about it. The next time Linda came over, I couldn't even look at her without wanting to scream. She acted like everything was normal, waltzing into the house with a bag of baby clothes and a tray of homemade cookies. "How's my little angel?" she cooed, scooping Noah up into her arms. I forced a smile, though my jaw ached from clenching it so hard. "He's fine," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She looked at me, her smile widening. "You know, Sarah, you're lucky to have me. Most new moms don't have someone like me to help them out." I wanted to tell her exactly where she could shove her help, but I bit my tongue. I needed to keep my cool, at least for now. Later that night, I sat down with Jake and laid out everything I'd found. The forged documents, the custody paperwork, and the patterns of manipulation. "This isn't just overbearing behavior," I said, pointing to the evidence spread out on the table. "She's trying to replace me, Jake. She wants to cut me out of my own child's life." Jake was silent for a long time, his face pale. "I can't believe she would do this," he said finally. "Well, she did," I snapped, "and now we have to decide what to do about it." He looked at me, his expression torn. "She's still my mom, Sarah. I can't just cut her off." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Jake, if you don't stand up to her, she'll never stop. Is that what you want? For her to keep controlling our lives?" He didn't answer, and the silence between us was louder than any argument. I knew then that this wasn't just about Linda anymore. This was about Jake, too, and whether he was willing to put his family first. But one thing was clear. I wasn't waiting for him to make a decision. Linda had crossed the line, and I was going to make damn sure she couldn't do it again. Linda's words, "Maybe you're not as good of a mother as you think you are," echoed in my head long after she left. I'd spent years dealing with her passive-aggressive jabs, but this was something else entirely. This was an attempt to take my place. Jake stayed silent as I paced the living room, furious and heartbroken. Finally, I turned to him. "Do you believe her?" I demanded. He shook his head, though his hesitation made my stomach sink. "I don't know, Sarah. She's my mom. I don't want to believe she'd go this far. She already has Jake. She's on Noah's birth certificate, and you think she might not mean it? She forged my signature. How much more proof do you need?" He didn't have an answer, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. The next morning, I called Katie, my best friend since college. She was one of the few people I trusted to help me figure this out without adding to the chaos. "Wait, what?" Katie said when I told her the whole story. "Yeah, my name is gone, Katie. It's like I don't even exist." "Okay," she said firmly. "We're going to fix this. First, you need to talk to a lawyer. Second, you need to gather every piece of evidence you have. Emails, texts, the paperwork with her forged signature. Everything." I nodded, jotting down notes as she spoke. "I already have most of it, but I don't know if it's enough." "It's enough to start," she said. "And Sarah, don't let her gaslight you into thinking this is normal. It's not. What she's doing is insane." That afternoon, I scheduled a consultation with a family attorney. I walked into the office armed with my stack of documents, my heart pounding as I laid them out on the desk. The attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, flipped through the papers with a frown. "This is bad," she said finally. "If she's managed to get her name on the birth certificate, it's not just fraud. It's a direct threat to your parental rights. But don't panic. We can fight this." "How?" I asked, desperate for answers. "First, we'll file to have the birth certificate corrected. That will involve proving the forgery, but based on what you've shown me, that shouldn't be hard. Second, we need to establish boundaries with your mother-in-law. Legal ones, like a restraining order?" "Possibly," Rachel said. "But let's start with a formal cease and desist letter. It'll send a clear message that her behavior is unacceptable, and that you're not afraid to take this further if she doesn't stop." I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. For the first time, I felt like I had some control. When I got home, I found Jake sitting in the living room, staring at his phone. "What are you doing?" I asked cautiously. "I called her," he said without looking up. My stomach sank. "Jake, what did you say?" "I told her to stop," he said. "I told her she crossed the line, and that we're fixing the birth certificate. And He hesitated, his jaw tightening. She said she didn't mean any harm, that it was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I laughed bitterly. That's what she's calling it. She said she'd back off. Jake continued, his voice quieter now. But I don't know, Sarah. She sounded weird. Weird didn't even begin to describe it. A few days later, Linda showed up unannounced. She walked into the house like nothing had happened, her arms full of baby supplies. Linda, I said, blocking her path. You can't just show up here anymore. We need to talk. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, brushing past me. I'm here to see my grandson. No, I said firmly. Not until we figure this out. She stopped and turned to me, her eyes narrowing. Figure what out, Sarah? I already told Jake it was a misunderstanding. You're blowing this way out of proportion. A misunderstanding doesn't involve forging signatures and replacing someone's name on a legal document, I snapped. Her smirk returned, cold and calculating. You're overreacting. I was just trying to help, but if you want to make this a big deal, go ahead. Let's see how that works out for you. That was the moment I realized Linda wasn't just manipulative. She was dangerous. She wasn't going to stop unless I stopped her. The next day, Rachel sent the cease and desist letter, officially putting Linda on notice. I hoped it would be enough to scare her into backing off, but deep down I knew better. Linda's reaction came swiftly and explosively. She called Jake, crying and accusing me of trying to cut her out of the family. She told him I was hysterical and unfit to be a mother. When Jake told me, I could see the doubt creeping into his expression again. Do you believe her? I asked, my voice shaking. No, he said quickly. But Sarah, this is getting out of control. Do we really need lawyers involved? Yes, Jake, I said, my anger boiling over. We do, because she's not going to stop. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem. His face fell, but I didn't have time to comfort him. I was done making excuses for Linda and for Jake. A week later, I got a call from Rachel. The court had approved my request to correct the birth certificate. Linda's name was officially removed and mine was restored. But instead of feeling relief, I felt a gnawing sense of unease, because I knew Linda wouldn't let this go quietly. The court ruling was a victory, but it didn't feel like the end. If anything, it felt like the beginning of a new battle. Linda didn't show up to contest the correction of the birth certificate, but her silence was far from comforting. Knowing her, she was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Jake and I sat in the kitchen the night after the ruling, the tension between us so thick it felt like a third presence in the room. She's going to escalate, I said, breaking the silence. Jake sighed, his face etched with exhaustion. Maybe. Or maybe she's realized she went too far. I laughed bitterly. You really believe that? I don't know, Sarah, he admitted. I just want things to go back to normal. Normal? I snapped. Jake, there is no going back to normal. Not after this. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. She's my mom, Sarah. What do you want me to do? Cut her out completely? I want you to protect your family, I said, my voice trembling with frustration. Me and Noah. Not her. Jake didn't respond, and his silence spoke louder than any words. The next morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and texts from Linda. I didn't bother reading them, but the notifications alone were enough to spike my anxiety. I showed the phone to Jake, who scrolled through the messages with a grim expression. She's saying you're poisoning me against her, he said, his voice strained. That you're trying to destroy the family. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm destroying the family? She's the one who tried to erase me from my own child's life. Jake looked at me, his face conflicted. I'll talk to her, he said. No, I said firmly, taking the phone from his hands. This is beyond talking, Jake. She's not going to listen to you. She's going to keep twisting everything until she's the victim and I'm the villain. Later that day, I met with Rachel to discuss next steps. The cease and desist letter had made it clear that Linda's behavior was unacceptable, but Rachel agreed it might not be enough to stop her. She's relentless, I said, running a hand through my hair. I can't keep living like this, Rachel. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for her next move. Rachel nodded sympathetically. We can escalate, she said. If she continues to harass you, we can file for a restraining order. But you need to be prepared. This could put even more strain on your marriage. I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. Jake had been supportive in some ways, but his loyalty to Linda was a constant wedge between us. I didn't want to give him an ultimatum, but I was starting to realize I might not have a choice. That night, I sat Jake down for a serious conversation. I can't do this anymore, Jake, I said, my voice shaking. I can't keep fighting Linda while also fighting you. I'm not fighting you, he said quickly. Then why does it feel like you're always defending her? I shot back. Why does it feel like I'm the only one willing to stand up to her? Jake looked away, guilt flickering across his face. She's your mom, I get that, I continued. But I'm your wife. I'm the mother of your child. And if you can't put us first, then my voice broke and I struggled to finish the sentence. Then what? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then maybe I need to figure out what's best for me and Noah. Without you, Jake didn't say anything right away. He just sat there, staring at the floor. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. You're right, he said. I've been trying to keep the peace, but all it's done is make things worse. I'll talk to her. Really talk to her. I wanted to believe him, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. Jake went to see Linda the next day. He didn't tell me what they talked about, but when he came home, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. She's not going to stop, he said, collapsing onto the couch. I told her she needs to back off, but she just kept saying she was doing what's best for Noah. I nodded, my heart sinking. So what do we do now? We fight, he said, his voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. Whatever it takes, Sarah. We fight. Linda didn't take the news well. She ramped up her efforts, calling other family members to paint herself as the victim. Suddenly, I was the cold-hearted wife who was tearing the family apart. One by one, Jake's relatives started reaching out, asking why I was being so unreasonable. She's manipulating everyone, I said to Jake after one particularly exhausting phone call. I know, he said, his frustration mounting. But they don't see it. They think she's just a sweet, concerned grandma. Then we show them the truth, I said. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Rachel to document everything. The forged signature, the birth certificate, the legal letters, every piece of evidence we had was laid out in black and white. When Linda tried to escalate her campaign, we were ready. The first time she showed up uninvited after the cease and desist letter, Rachel filed for a restraining order. When she tried to contact other family members to stir up drama, we sent them copies of the evidence. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. But the fight wasn't over. Linda wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat, and I knew she was still plotting her next move. And Jake? He was doing his best to stand by me, but the strain on our marriage was undeniable. As I lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, how much more could we take? The day we finally got the restraining order was supposed to feel like a victory. Rachel assured me that this was a major step toward reclaiming our lives, and legally it was. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the kind of battle that ended with paperwork. Linda wouldn't let it. Jake and I sat in silence on the drive home from the courthouse. Noah was strapped into his car seat, babbling happily, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had consumed our lives. She's going to hate me for this, Jake said quietly, breaking the silence. She already does, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Not because of you, Jake. Because she hates not being in control. He nodded but didn't say anything else. I could tell he was struggling, torn between loyalty to me and the woman who had raised him. For a while, things were quiet. Linda stayed away, likely because of the legal consequences hanging over her head. The phone calls stopped, the surprise visits ceased, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But it didn't last. One Saturday morning, Jake came into the kitchen with his phone in his hand, his face pale. She posted something online, he said, his voice trembling. What did she say? I asked, bracing myself. He handed me the phone, and my stomach churned as I read the post. Linda had written a long, emotional diatribe about being cut off from her grandson by a vindictive daughter-in-law. She painted herself as the ultimate victim, claiming she had only ever wanted to help and that I was using legal threats to keep her away from her precious grandbaby. The comments were filled with sympathy, people rallying behind her without knowing the full story. This is exactly what I was afraid of, I said, slamming the phone down on the counter. She's turning this into a public spectacle. She's trying to get people on her side, Jake said, rubbing his temples. She knows she can't come after us directly anymore, so she's doing this instead. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding. What do we do now? Rachel advised us to ignore it. Engaging will only give her more ammunition, she said. Let her dig her own grave. The truth will come out eventually, but the damage was already done. Jake's extended family started reaching out, questioning why we were keeping Noah away from his grandmother. No matter how much we explained, some of them refused to see Linda for who she really was. She's your family, one of Jake's aunts said during a tense phone call. You don't just cut family off like that. You do when they're toxic, Jake replied, his voice steady but strained. The cracks in our marriage deepened. Every conversation seemed to circle back to Linda her manipulations, and the fallout from her actions. I wanted to believe Jake was fully on my side, but I could see how much he was struggling. One night, after putting Noah to bed, I finally confronted him. "Jake," I said, sitting down beside him on the couch, "I need to know where you stand." He looked at me, his eyes tired and sad. "I stand with you, Sarah. I always have." "Then why does it feel like you're still defending her?" "I'm not defending her," he said quickly. "But it's complicated. She's my mom, and no matter what she's done, I can't just pretend she doesn't exist." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "And what about me, Jake? What about Noah? If she can't respect our boundaries, how can we ever let her back into our lives?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't have the answers, Sarah. I just know that I don't want to lose you, or my mom." His words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for the first time, I realized how deeply this was tearing him apart. A few weeks later, Linda made one final move. We received a letter in the mail, a handwritten apology from her. In it, she claimed to regret her actions and begged for another chance to be part of Noah's life. "I just want to make things right," she wrote. "I've made mistakes, but I love my family, and I don't want to lose you." Jake read the letter out loud, his voice filled with emotion. "Maybe she's finally starting to understand," he said, looking at me hopefully. But I wasn't convinced. "This isn't an apology," I said, shaking my head. "It's a manipulation. She doesn't regret what she did. She regrets getting caught." Jake didn't respond, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. We never responded to Linda's letter. Instead, we focused on moving forward, trying to rebuild our lives without her looming presence. But the damage she caused lingered like a shadow, always there in the background, waiting to resurface. Jake and I continued to work on our marriage, but the strain never fully disappeared. Some days, it felt like we were stronger than ever. Other days, I couldn't help but wonder if Linda's influence would always be a wedge between us. As I sit here now, writing this, I wish I could tell you how it all ends. I wish I could say Linda finally stopped, that Jake and I found peace, and that Noah grew up surrounded by nothing but love and support. But life isn't that simple. All I can say is this: I'm doing everything I can to protect my family, even if it means making hard choices. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that love, real love, isn't about control. It's about respect. And as much as Linda wants to be part of our lives, I won't let her back in unless she learns that lesson. Maybe she'll change. Maybe she won't. But for now, I'm choosing to move forward. And that's enough.